I wish I knew how it would feel to be free. I wish I could break all the chains holding me. I wish I could say all the things that I should say. Say them loud, say them clear, for the whole round world to hear. I wish I could share all the love that's in my heart. Remove all the bars that keep us apart. I wish you could know what it means to be me. Then you'd see and agree that every man should be free.
Back in colonial days, Americans were largely self-sufficient. They raised most of what they ate and made most of what they wore and used. Thomas Jefferson called it the ideal life of the small farmer, owning your own land and not being beholden to anyone. But with so much labor and so little mechanical help, many people had to work all the time just to survive. And then something happened in the late 18th century that changed the way people lived and worked. It was called the Industrial Revolution, and it actually began in England, where things once made at home, like cotton and cloth, were being made faster and often better in factories. William Radcliffe owned one of the first English cotton mills.
Our hand wheels were all thrown out. The yarn was now spun on common jennies. The carding was done on carding machines. 1788 to 1803, I will call the golden age of this great trade.
But the English had no intention of sharing their new technology. To prevent the spreading of information about industrial machinery, no one who worked in a British factory was allowed to leave the country. And complex agreements known as indentures kept workers like Samuel Slater legally bound to their factories.
This indenture witnesseth that Samuel Slater doth put himself apprentice to Jedediah Strutt for the term of 6 years and a half, during which time he faithfully shall serve his secrets and keep his loyal commands.
In America, big rewards were being offered to anyone who could build a cotton spinning machine in the United States. Sam Slater decided to memorize the way the spinning machines in Jedediah Strutt's cotton factory were built and operated.
My object was to get a general knowledge of the business in order to introduce the manufacture of cotton to America.
In 1784, Slater ran off to London, pretended to be a farm worker, and caught a boat for America. He had the key to the Industrial Revolution with him, in his head. Rhode Island businessman Moses Brown was intrigued.
We are destitute of a person acquainted with water frame spinning. Come and work with us and have the credit of perfecting the first water mill in America.
I flatter myself that I can give you the greatest satisfaction. I had an oversight in Mr. Strutt's mill upwards of 8 years.
In 1790, Sam built a small cotton spinning factory next to a waterfall in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. Years later, Sam Slater would become known as the father of the American Industrial Revolution. Once Americans figured out how to produce goods in large volumes, they needed an efficient way of distributing them. In the early days of the 19th century, roads were certainly no answer. They were mostly ruts, holes, mud, and stones. And when you came to a river, there was no bridge. Josiah Quincy was a Massachusetts aristocrat who traveled frequently in his role as an attorney.
Whether it snowed or rained, the traveler must rise and make ready by the help of a horn lantern and a candle, and proceed on his way over bad roads, sometimes getting out to help the coachman lift the coach out of a quagmire or rut.
About 1806, it was decided that what was needed was a well-constructed road that would cross the country as far as the Mississippi River. It would be called the National Road, and it would be paid for by the federal government because it would stimulate free trade across America. It would help bring about what would be called the market revolution.
What we call the market revolution, that is the welding together of the United States into a kind of national market, has very contradictory results for people's attitudes towards freedom. On the one hand, it greatly expands the freedom of enterprise, the opportunities available to businessmen, entrepreneurs to produce goods, to meet the demands of this growing market. On the other hand, the traditional idea of economic freedom was based on economic independence. The truly free person was autonomous, but economic development undermines that autonomy. So freedom is going in two ways at the same time. Some people are benefiting enormously. Some people are losing what they think is their traditional economic freedom.
At first, not everyone agreed on the idea of building a national road. People in the West wanted it as they were much more isolated. But people in the East didn't feel they needed it as much and felt it was unfair for them to have to pay taxes for it. And in the South, people were against it because of their belief in states' rights. They didn't think the federal government should pay for roads. But despite it all, the national road was built. Construction, then reconstruction, lasted for decades as engineers came up with new ways to make for a smooth ride. Charles Fenno Hoffman was a travel writer who covered the national road.
It appears to have been originally constructed of large, round stones. These are now being plowed up, and a thin layer of broken stones is in many places spread over the renovated surface. It yields like snowdrift to the weary wheels that traverse it.
By 1833, the national road stretched as far as Columbus, Ohio. Jessie Benton was the daughter of a famous senator from Missouri and traveled the road regularly.
My father would see we had one of the best reserved coaches, packed with such things as children might need for a week. We had fresh horses every 10 miles. If we were very good, we earned the privilege of sitting by the driver and seeing the 4 eager horses dash away.
Before the national road was built, it took 4 weeks to travel from Baltimore to St. Louis. On the road, if you traveled without stopping, you could make St. Louis in 4 days. As towns sprang up along its route, the national road became known as Main Street of America. But for Missouri West, there was no road, just wilderness and a dangerous ride. That's where the Pony Express took over. Mail carriers galloped as fast as they could between 190 Pony Express stations, switching to a fresh horse at every stop. At every 8th station, a new rider would take over. The trip from Missouri to Sacramento, California took just 10 days. Jeff Thompson was the mayor of St. Joseph, Missouri, the headquarters of the Pony Express.
For more than a decade, St. Joseph has been the portal through which passed the wagon trains for the Great West. Now she's to become the connecting link between the extremes of the continents. For the first time in the history of America, mail will go by overland route from east to west. 3 cheers for the Pony Express.
Roads were good for passengers and mail, but for moving bulk freight, rivers were better. Back at the end of the 18th century, several people had figured out that steam from boiling water could push a boat. The best steamboats in America were soon being built by the inventor Robert Fulton. In 1807, Fulton's steamboat, the Clermont, chugged 150 miles up the Hudson River, from New York to Albany.
Throughout my whole way, the wind was ahead. No advantage could be derived from sails. The whole work has been performed by the power of the steam engine. The success of my experiment gives me great hopes that such boats may render great importance to my country.
And then people began to push for the building of canals, which would connect the lakes and rivers on which steamboats operated. To create a water route between New York City and the Midwest, a canal was proposed that would link Albany to Buffalo. There, steamboats could carry goods along the Great Lakes all the way west to the city of Chicago. Governor DeWitt Clinton of New York pushed hard for the project.
It will create the greatest inland trade ever witnessed. The most fertile and extensive regions of America will avail themselves of its facilities for a market. All their productions will concentrate in the city of New York, and the city will become the granary of the world, the emporium of commerce, the seat of manufacturers, and the focus of great moneyed operations.
Admirers called the canal Clinton's dream, but most others called it Clinton's folly. It meant crossing 363 miles of the wilds of New York State. No canal that long had ever been built. No one was even sure it could be done. It took thousands of men to do the job, many of them Irish immigrants, paid $10 a month to hand dig the canal using shovels. And it required 83 locks to raise and lower boats, and an aqueduct to carry them across the Mohawk River. After 8 years and $7 million, the Erie Canal was complete and ready for business. Before the canal was opened in 1825, it cost $100 a ton to ship grain from Buffalo to New York. By the 1830s, it cost just $8 a ton. Nothing could stop the technological revolution. In 1830, trains were pulled along railroad tracks by horses. Peter Cooper, an inventor, said he could put a steam engine on those tracks that would travel even faster. He built a small locomotive he named Tom Thumb, then challenged the directors of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad to a race.
We started, 6 on the engine and 36 in the car. It was a great occasion. We made the passage to Ellicott's Mills in an hour and 12 minutes.
It was a close contest, but the steam engine won. Within a year, every horse on the B&O Railroad had been replaced by a locomotive. By 1840, there were about 3,000 miles of railroad track in America. 20 years later, there would be 30,000 miles. When railroad tracks finally reached the Mississippi River, a bridge was built and a young reporter was among the first to cross.
The cars moved on. The bridge was reached. We're on the bridge. See the mighty Mississippi rolling on beneath. And all eyes were fastened on the mighty parapets of the magnificent bridge, over which we glided in solemn silence. A few minutes, and the suspended breath was let loose. We're over, was the cry. We have crossed the Mississippi in a railroad car.
In the 19th century, Americans were fascinated with machines. They were in love with speed, with locomotives and steamboats, and with the freedom of movement they now allowed. They were in love with labor-saving American inventions: John Deere's steel plow, Cyrus McCormick's reaper, and Elias Howe's sewing machine. It was a time of new freedoms and of new prosperity, and Americans became famous all over the world for know-how, as the Massachusetts scholar Edward Everett noted.
Day after day, some new product of American ingenuity was added to the list. The leading journal in London admitted that England had derived a more real benefit from the United States than from any other country.
Thanks to American ingenuity, it was a time of extraordinary new freedoms. Ordinary Americans could afford things they'd never been able to buy before. It made life better for most people, but not for everyone. By the 1840s, there were large numbers of poor workers in American cities, and the first organized labor movements had started to form. The writer and reformer Catherine Beecher went undercover inside a textile mill in Lawrence, Massachusetts, to investigate the working conditions.
I was there in midwinter, and every morning I was awakened at 5 by the bells calling to labor. The work at the mill was begun by lamplight and prosecuted without remission till 12, and chiefly in a standing position. Then half an hour only allowed for dinner, then back to the mills, to work till 7 o'clock. It must be remembered that all the hours of labor are spent in rooms where oil lamps, together with from 40 to 80 persons, are exhausting the healthful principle of the air, and where the air is loaded with particles of cotton thrown from thousands of cards, spindles, and looms.
More and more people have to go to work in factories, in workshops, go to work for other people. To work in a factory is considered the opposite of the free individual. You are under the supervision of someone else, you are working for wages, you have long hours, low pay, no actual ability to determine your own working conditions. Most men do not want to go and work in these factories. The early factories are staffed by people who have no other economic options, namely women and sometimes children, because to them, these are opportunities which don't exist anywhere else.
Work in the new American factories was mind-dulling. The writer Herman Melville visited a paper factory in 1855.
At rows of blank-looking counters sat rows of blank-looking girls with blank white folders in their blank hands, all blankly folding blank paper. Nothing was heard but the low, steady, overruling hum of the iron animals. The human voice was banished from the spot. Machinery, that vaunted slave of humanity, here stood menially served by human beings as slaves serve the Sultan.
In the new code of laws which it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could.
Abigail Adams wrote those words to her husband John at the time of the American Revolution. But Abigail's words fell on deaf ears. The so-called experts of the day believed that women's brains were smaller than men's, and that girls could not learn as much as boys. So most girls in the 19th century were forced to stay home while the boys got an education. Sarah Pierce of Connecticut refused to accept this. She started her own school, the Litchfield Female Academy, in the dining room of her home. Mary Lyon of Massachusetts was another strong-minded woman who refused to accept boundaries drawn by others. She believed women should go to college. When she learned there were no colleges for women, she started one. Mount Holyoke College opened in Massachusetts in 1837 with 4 teachers and 116 students. A future poet, Emily Dickinson, soon enrolled.
The school is very large. Quite a number of girls have left on account of finding the examinations more difficult than they anticipated. Miss Lyon is raising the standard of scholarship a great deal.
Married women were often worse off than single women, victims of prejudice whose achievements were usually ignored. When Julia Ward Howe wrote and published a poem, she feared her husband's response.
I have never known my husband to approve of any act of mine which I myself valued. Books, poems, essays, everything has been contemptible in his eyes because not his way of doing things.
Well, the tradition, the law inherited from Britain was called the law of coverture, and it comes from the word cover, and it literally means that a married woman is covered legally by her husband. Her legal identity is subsumed into her husband. She can't own property without her husband's permission. She can't sign a contract. Her wages, if she works, are actually the property of her husband. All of her legal rights are exercised through her husband. That's why women are not entitled to the right to vote, according to men, because it's the husband who is representing the family in the political realm. It takes a long time for a movement to develop and for the idea to get widespread acceptance that women are entitled to the same individual rights as men, even if they happen to be married. That marriage should not lead to legal death, which it does up to really the middle of the 19th century.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a married woman with 7 children. All her life, she had to balance family with public duties. In 1848, she gathered with 300 others for a women's freedom conference at Seneca Falls in New York State. They put together what they called a Declaration of Sentiments, based in part on the Declaration of Independence.
The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries on the part of man towards woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal.
The Declaration demanded the right to education, the right to job opportunities, and the right to custody over children in the event of divorce. It called for equal opportunities for women and the right to vote. 68 women signed the Seneca Falls Declaration, and 32 men were recorded as present. But newspapers made a mockery of the Declaration, triggering a public backlash.
No words could express our astonishment on finding a few days afterward that what seemed to us so timely, so rational, so sacred, should be subject for sarcasm and ridicule to the entire press of the nation. So pronounced was the popular voice against us that most of the ladies who had attended the convention and signed the Declaration, one by one, withdrew their names and influence and joined our persecutors.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton realized that if you were a woman or an African American, you were still a virtual prisoner in 19th century America.
To you, white man, the world throws wide her gates, but the black man and the woman are born to shame. The badge of degradation is the skin and the sex. Man is born to do whatever he can. For the woman and the Negro, there is no such privilege.
For decades, the feminists and the abolitionists became close allies. Sojourner Truth was a former slave who joined the women's movement. Almost 6 feet tall, she wore a gray dress with a white shawl and a white turban wrapped around her head. When she spoke, her voice was like rolling thunder, and crowds were mesmerized.
Ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I've plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I've borne 13 children and seen the most all sold off to slavery. Ain't I a woman?